The escape pod hit the ground hard, and Commander Elira Voss felt her teeth rattle inside her skull as metal scraped against rock and soil and things she could not see in the darkness. She had been sleeping in her quarters aboard the transport. Ship meridians grace when the alarm started screaming, and the whole vessel shook like a toy in the hands of an angry child, and before she could even reach the bridge, the emergency protocols had already thrown her into this pod and launched her toward the nearest planet. Now she was here, wherever here was. The pod's emergency lights flickered red and orange as she pushed herself up from the crash harness and checked her body for injuries and found nothing broken but plenty of bruises. That would hurt worse tomorrow if she lived to see tomorrow. Her suit's computer made a soft chiming sound and projected information onto the small screen built into her wrist, and she read the words 3 times because she did not want to believe them the first 2 times. Vex's 9 Category 7 Death World. No intelligent species detected. No colonies present. No rescue infrastructure available. Planetary warning status. Permanent isolation recommended. She knew what Category 7 meant because every human who traveled through space learned the classification system during their first week of training, and Category 7 was the worst rating any planet could receive, and it meant that the world was so dangerous that even attempting to land there was considered suicide. 3 colonization attempts had been made on Vex's 9 over the past 200 years, and all 3 had ended in complete failure with no survivors, and the Galactic Council had eventually just given up and marked the planet with warning beacons that told all ships to stay away. And now she was sitting in a broken escape pod on the surface of this planet with night falling fast around her. Elira opened the pod's emergency compartment and pulled out everything inside and laid it all on the ground in front of her so she could see what she had to work with. 1 multi-tool with 12 different functions, including a blade and a small saw and pliers. 1 water purifier that could clean about 2 liters per hour. Emergency food rations that would last 6 days if she ate carefully. 1 thermal blanket made of thin, reflective material. 1 distress beacon with a transmitter that showed damage from the crash. She picked up the beacon and turned it over in her hands and saw the crack running down its side and pressed the activation button anyway and watched the small light blink weakly as it tried to send a signal into the sky. The computer in her suit calculated the probability of the signal reaching a passing ship, and the number it showed her was not encouraging, but it was not 0 either, and that meant she had somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks to survive before rescue might come, if rescue came at all. She looked up at the sky through the trees that surrounded her crash site and saw 3 moons rising over the horizon, and their pale light made everything look silver and strange and beautiful in a way that felt like a trap. Then she heard the first sounds from the forest. Something was moving out there in the darkness between the massive trees, and it was not moving quietly, and she could hear branches breaking and leaves rustling, and the heavy thud of large feet hitting the ground. Elira grabbed her multi-tool and flicked open the blade and held it in front of her, even though she knew that a small knife would do nothing against whatever was making those sounds. More movement now from a different direction and then another direction, and she realized that there was not just 1 creature out there, but many, and they were circling her crash site like wolves circling wounded prey. Eyes appeared in the darkness. Dozens of them. They reflected the weak light of the moons and glowed like small yellow lamps floating in the black space between the trees, and they did not blink. And they did not look away. Elira's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. But she did not let herself panic, because panic was death, and death was not something she planned to accept on her first night on this planet. She remembered something from her survival training and reached back into the escape pod and found the emergency flare that she had overlooked before, and she ripped off the cap and struck it against the rough surface of the pod, and the flare burst into brilliant red light that pushed back the darkness and made the watching eyes disappear into the shadows. The creatures in the forest made sounds of confusion and alarm, and she heard them retreating from the sudden brightness, and she knew that she had bought herself time, but not much time, because flares burned out eventually, and darkness always returned. She needed fire, real fire that would last through the night. Alira gathered dried leaves and small sticks from the ground near her pod and piled them together and used her multi-tool to create sparks, and after many attempts that left her fingers aching, she finally managed to create a small flame that caught the leaves and began to grow. She fed the fire carefully with bigger sticks and then with branches, and soon she had a blaze large enough to push the darkness back several meters in every direction. The eyes in the forest watched from a safer distance now, but they did not leave. Something massive crashed through the undergrowth far away, and the ground shook slightly beneath her feet, and even the creatures with the glowing eyes seemed to shrink back from whatever had made that sound. Alira sat with her back against the escape pod and her fire between her and the forest, and she held her knife. And she watched, and she did not sleep. She thought about her crew aboard the Meridian's Grace, and wondered if any of them had survived the attack, and she thought about her family back on Earth, who would receive a notification that her ship had been lost, and she thought about all the things she had planned to do with her life that might never happen now. But mostly she thought about the next few hours and how she was going to survive them. The night stretched on forever, and the creatures in the forest kept watching and testing and probing the edges of her firelight, and twice she had to throw burning branches at shadows that got too close. When the first light of dawn finally appeared over the horizon, Alira was exhausted and hungry and terrified, but she was still alive. She stood up on shaking legs and looked at the forest around her and saw it clearly for the first time in the pale morning light, and it was vast and ancient and full of things that wanted to eat her. But she was still alive. As long as she was alive, she could fight and plan and build, and refuse to become just another failed colonist whose bones would rot on this death world. She picked up her multi-tool and her water purifier and the rest of her meager supplies, and she started walking toward higher ground where she could see the land around her and find a place to make her stand. The creatures in the forest followed her at a distance and watched with their hungry yellow eyes. Alira did not look back at them. She had work to do. Alira spent her second day on Vex's 9, doing something that most species would consider insane. She watched the things that wanted to kill her. Instead of running or hiding or curling up in terror, she found a tall tree with thick branches, and she climbed it, and she sat there for hours, and she observed the predators of this death world as they went about their business below. The creatures she had seen the night before were easier to study in daylight, and she could see now that they were six-legged hunters with sleek dark fur and ridges of bone running down their spines, like natural armor, and mouths full of teeth that curved backward to prevent prey from escaping once bitten. She decided to call them razorbacks. The razorbacks moved through the forest in packs of 5 to 8, and they communicated with each other through clicks and growls, and they hunted by ambush rather than by chase. And this was important information because it told her something useful. They would not charge across open ground. They needed cover and surprise, and the advantage of attacking from hiding. And if she could take those things away from them, she could reduce the danger they represented. She watched other creatures too. They were small, fast things that looked like lizards with too many legs, and they seemed to eat insects and were probably not dangerous unless she was the size of an insect. There were flying creatures with wide leathery wings that circled high above the forest canopy and dove down occasionally to snatch something from the trees, and she made a note to never stand in open spaces where they could see her. And then there were the big ones. The first time she felt the ground shake, she thought it was an earthquake. But then she saw the trees in the distance swaying and falling, and a shape moved through the forest that was so large her brain struggled to understand what she was seeing. It was like someone had taken a mountain and given it legs and covered in plates of natural armor that looked like stone, and it moved slowly, but with terrible purpose, and everything in its path either fled or was. Krusty did not have a name for this creature yet. She just called it Death, and she to stay far away from wherever it walked. By midday, she had learned enough to start making a plan. Razorbacks avoided certain areas of the forest, and when she climbed down from her tree and investigated those areas, she discovered why sulfur springs. The ground in several places bubbled with hot water that smelled like rotten eggs, and the smell was unpleasant to Alira, but apparently unbearable to the Razorbacks, because she never saw them come within 100 meters of the springs. She found a clearing near the largest spring where the smell was strong, but not overwhelming, and she decided that this would be her home. The work began immediately, used her multi-tool to cut branches from the trees, and she sharpened the ends into points. And she drove them into the ground in a circle around the clearing, with the points facing outward like the quills of a giant porcupine. Her hands blistered and bled, and the blisters broke and bled more. But she did not stop. She found a flat rock and lashed it to a sturdy stick with vines and created a primitive shovel, and she used this tool to dig a trench around the outside of her stake wall, and the digging took hours and left her muscles screaming. She filled the trench with water from the sulfur spring, and the water was hot and yellow, and it stank, but it created another barrier that the Razorbacks would not want to cross. By the time the sun began to set on her second day, she had the beginning of a perimeter. It was not much, just a circle of pointed stakes and a shallow trench, and a small fire pit in the center where she could cook and stay warm. But a circle of pointed stakes and a shallow trench and a shallow trench and a small fire pit in the center where she could cook and stay warm. But it was something. It was a start far above the planet in the cold emptiness of space. A small drone passed through the system on a routine documentation mission, and its sensors detected the anomaly on the surface, and it recorded footage and sent the data back to its handlers. The analyst who reviewed the footage was a Tellurian named Kovacs, who had been documenting death worlds for 30 years and had never seen anything like what appeared on his screen. A human alone on Vex's 9 building something watched the tiny figure in the footage as it cut and dug and arranged and constructed, and he could not understand what he was seeing, because humans were supposed to be fragile creatures who died easily and needed technology to survive. And this human had almost no technology at all. He flagged the footage for follow-up and added a note that said simply, "Observation recommended." Down on the surface, Alira finished her first wall just as darkness fell, and she sat inside her small protected space and watched the eyes appear in the forest beyond the sulfur trench. The Razorbacks were there, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. One of them was braver than the others, or perhaps just hungrier, and it approached the trench and sniffed the air and made a sound of disgust and backed away. Another one tried to find a gap in the stake wall and found none, and retreated with a growl of frustration. Alar added more wood to her fire and ate half a ration bar and drank water she had purified from a clean stream she found earlier, and she allowed herself to feel something she had not felt since the crash. Hope she was not safe. She was still in terrible danger, and the Razorbacks could probably find a way through her defenses if they really tried, and there were bigger things in this forest that would treat her little wall like a minor inconvenience. But she had made it through one day, and now she would make it through another. She would build her walls higher and her trenches deeper, and she would learn more about this world and its creatures, and she would find ways to turn their instincts against them. The Razorbacks did not understand what she was doing. They had never seen prey that stood still and built things and refused to run. They were confused, and confusion made them cautious, and caution kept them outside her perimeter while she slept in short shifts with one eye always open. When morning came, Alira stood up and stretched her aching body and looked at the work she had done and the work that still needed to be done. The wall needed to be taller. The trench needed to be wider. She needed More spikes and better tools and some kind of elevated platform where she could sleep off the ground. She picked up her multi-tool and got back to work. Razorbacks watched from the tree line as the strange small creature that refused to behave like prey continued to change the landscape around it. They did not attack. They were waiting to see what would happen next. They would wait for a long time. By the end of her first week on Vex's 9, Elira had learned that fire was more than just warmth and light. Fire was power. Fire was language. Fire was the one thing on this planet that every creature understood and feared. She discovered this by accident. On her fourth day, when she was trying to drive away the swarms of tiny, flying parasites that came out at dusk and bit any exposed skin and left welts that itched for hours, she had tried covering herself with mud, and that worked a little, but the parasites were persistent, and they found gaps in the mud and bit her anyway. Then she threw some leaves on her fire to make it burn hotter, and the leaves happened to be from a plant with thick, oily stems, and when they burned, they produced a thick, white smoke that smelled like medicine, and the parasites fled from it like they were being chased by death itself. Elira spent the next day collecting more of those plants and learning which ones made the best smoke, and by the end of that day, she had created a ring of small fires around her camp that burned day and night and produced constant smoke that kept the parasites away. The Razorbacks noticed the smoke too. They did not like it any more than the parasites did, and they began keeping an even greater distance from her territory. Word spread through the predator population of this region in the way that information spreads among animals, through scent and sound and observation, and the avoidance of areas where other predators had encountered something strange. Something had claimed the land near the sulfur springs, something that smelled like smoke and did not run and made walls out of trees and trenches out of earth. The smaller creatures avoided the area because the Razorbacks avoided it, and the Razorbacks avoided it because something about the smoke and the fire and the stubborn prey made them uncomfortable in ways their simple brains could not explain. And then the monarch came. Elira saw it for the first time on the seventh day, just as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if she had time to appreciate beauty. It emerged from the forest on the far side of the clearing, and it was bigger than anything she had ever seen that was not a building or a spacecraft. 12 feet tall at the shoulder, 4 legs as thick as tree trunks, a body covered in overlapping plates of bone that looked like natural armor designed by evolution to stop anything from hurting the creature underneath. A head with jaws that could bite through metal and eyes that glowed with an intelligence that made her stomach drop. This was not like the Razorbacks. The Razorbacks were predators, but they were simple, and they operated on instinct and hunger and fear. This thing was different. This thing looked at her camp and her fires and her walls, and she could see it thinking. She could see it calculating. The monarch had ruled this territory for decades. Nothing challenged it. Nothing survived challenging it. Every creature on this part of the planet knew to flee when the monarch approached, and those that did not flee became food. And now there was something new in its territory, something that had built structures and lit fires and changed the land without permission. The monarch walked slowly toward her camp, and the ground shook with each step, and Elira felt terror rising in her chest like cold water filling her lungs. She could run. She could abandon her camp and flee into the forest, and hope that the Razorbacks would be too surprised to catch her and maybe find another place to hide. But if she ran, she would lose everything she had built. She would be back to nothing. She would be prey. Again, Elira grabbed a burning branch from her main fire and then grabbed another one, and she held them both in front of her. And she walked to the edge of her perimeter, and she stood there facing the mountain of armor and teeth that was walking toward her. The monarch stopped. It had never seen prey do this before. Prey ran prey. Prey did not walk toward danger holding fire and making eye contact. Elira opened her mouth and screamed. She screamed as loud as she could, and the sound was raw and primal and full of all the fear and anger and defiance that had been building inside her since the moment she crashed on this planet. She screamed at the monster that she would not run. She screamed at the universe that she refused to die. Quietly, she screamed at herself to be brave, even though her legs were shaking and her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The monarch took another step forward, and Alira threw one of her burning branches, and it landed on the Fontos ground in front of the creature, and the flames spread through the dry grass and created a line of fire between them. The monarch stopped again. It made a sound deep in its throat that might have been confusion or curiosity or anger. Alira ran back to her fire pit and grabbed more fuel and threw it onto her fires until they roared higher than her head, and the heat was so intense she could feel her skin tightening. She found the hollow log she had been using as a container, and she flipped it over and began beating it with a stick, and the sound that came out was deep and loud and rhythmic like a heartbeat made of thunder. The monarch stood at the edge of her territory for 3 hours. It watched the fire and listened to the drums, and observed the small creature that made so much noise and light and refused to show submission. Alira did not stop beating the drum, as she did not let her fires die down, and she did not look away from those glowing eyes. Her arms burned with exhaustion and her throat was raw from screaming, and her eyes stung from smoke, but she did not stop. Finally, as the last light of day disappeared from the sky, the monarch turned around and walked back into the forest. It did not look back. Alira collapsed next to her fire and lay there gasping for breath and shaking with exhaustion and the release of tension that had been holding her body rigid for hours. The razorbacks in the surrounding forest had watched the entire confrontation. They had seen their apex predator, the thing they feared most in all the world, walk away from the strange small creature with the fire. They did not understand what had happened, but they understood the result. The territory near the sulfur springs belonged to something new now, something that even the monarch respected. Alira lay on the ground and looked up at the 3 moons rising over the trees, and she laughed even though nothing was funny, because she was still alive and she had just stared down the most dangerous creature on this planet, and one tomorrow she would build her walls higher. Tomorrow she would make her fires bigger. Tomorrow she would show this death world that it had made a mistake when it tried to kill her. But tonight she would rest and let her body recover and enjoy the simple miracle of still being alive. The monarch did not return that night, or the next night or ever again, and the legend of the creature near the sulfur springs began to grow among the predators of Vex's 9. By the end of her second week on Vex's 9, Alira had transformed her small circle of stakes into something that looked less like a desperate survival shelter and more like a fortress. The outer perimeter now extended 30 meters from her central fire pit, and it was marked not just by stakes and trenches, but by trophies. She had killed her first razorback on day 9 when one of the younger and more foolish members of a nearby pack had decided to test her defenses alone, and she had caught it in a pit trap she had dug and covered with branches and finished it with her spear. The spear was new. She had made it from a straight branch and a sharpened stone, and it was crude, but it worked, and it gave her reach that her small knife could not provide. After killing the razorback, she had skinned it and eaten the meat and hung the skull on a stake at the edge of her territory facing outward, so that any creature approaching would see it and understand. This is what happens to things that enter my space. More skulls followed as the days passed, some from razorbacks that made the same mistake as the first, some from smaller creatures that she hunted for food, one from a flying predator that had swooped too low and discovered that Alira had become very good at throwing her spear. The skull spoke a language that every predator understood. This territory is claimed. The one who lives here is dangerous. Stay away. Inside the outer perimeter, she had built a second ring of defenses with taller stakes and deeper trenches, and this ring surrounded her living space where she had constructed a raised platform out of logs. lashed together with vines. Sleeping off the ground was important because many of the smaller creatures on Vex's 9 hunted by crawling along the forest floor at night and feeling for the body heat of sleeping prey. The platform kept her above their reach, and the fire she kept burning beneath it added another layer of protection. She had also started a garden. This was perhaps the strangest thing she had done, and it confused the Tellurian analyst Kovacs, who was still monitoring her progress through the scout drone that passed overhead every few days. Humans. On Death, worlds did not plant gardens. Humans on Death worlds focused entirely on survival and escape, and they did not take time to cultivate plants as if they planned to stay. But Alira had found several species of plants that were edible, and she had transplanted them into a cleared area near her shelter, and she watered them daily with purified water and protected them from animals with a small fence. She was not just surviving anymore, she was building a life. The drone footage showed her camp growing day by day, and the analysts at Galactic Survey headquarters watched with increasing amazement as a single human with almost no technology carved out a piece of civilization on a world that had defeated entire colonization efforts, equipped with advanced equipment and dozens of trained personnel. How was she doing this? What made humans capable of this kind of adaptation? The answer was something that most species in the galaxy did not understand, because most species had evolved in environments that were relatively safe and predictable, and they had never needed to develop the specific combination of traits that humans possessed: stubbornness, creativity, the ability to turn fear into fuel instead of paralysis, the refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed certain. Alira did not know that she was being watched and analyzed and discussed in conference rooms across the galaxy. She only knew that she needed to survive until rescue came, and that meant building her defenses stronger every day. On day 14, the Razorbacks finally made their move. Not one or two of them, this time 15 Razorbacks from 3 different packs that had been pushed out of their normal hunting grounds by the Monarch's increased aggression since its confrontation with Elirathi, were hungry and desperate, and they had decided together, in whatever way pack animals make decisions, that the strange creature in the Sulphur Spring territory was their best option for food. They gathered at the edge of her outer perimeter just before dawn, when the fires were at their lowest, and they began probing for weaknesses. Alira woke to the sound of stakes being pushed and scratched, and she grabbed her spear and ran to see what was happening, and her heart nearly stopped when she counted the glowing eyes in the pre-dawn darkness. Too many, far too many. She could not fight 15 Razorbacks at once. She could not hold all points of her perimeter simultaneously, but she could think, she could adapt. She could use what she had learned about these creatures against them. The Razorbacks were ambush predators. They relied on surprise and overwhelming force delivered in a sudden rush. If she could channel that rush and control where it went, she could turn their numbers from an advantage into a weakness. Alira ran to the eastern side of her perimeter, and she pulled up several stakes, creating a visible gap in her defenses, and then she retreated toward her central fire and waited. Razorbacks saw the gap. Their pack instincts told them that gaps meant opportunity, and opportunity meant food, and 3 of them rushed through the opening together. They ran straight into the killing ground she had prepared. The narrow channel between walls of thorns was barely wide enough for 1 Razorback, and certainly not wide enough for 3, and they jammed together and stumbled over each other, and before they could untangle themselves, they fell into the pit she had dug and covered with woven branches. The pit was deep, and the bottom was lined with sharpened stakes, and the 3 Razorbacks died, screaming. The others heard the screams and hesitated, and that hesitation was all Alira needed. She charged at the gap with her spear and a burning torch, and she screamed her war cry, and she looked like a demon. Emerging from the smoke and flames of her fires, the Razorbacks had never encountered anything like this. Prey did not charge. Prey did not attack prey, did not emerge from fire like a monster. They scattered in confusion, and Illyra caught one of them with it. Her spear through its neck and it collapsed, and she pulled her weapon free and spun to face the next threat too. More razorbacks attacked, and she killed one and wounded another, and the wounded one fled howling, and the rest of the pack decided that this prey was not worth dying for, and they retreated into the forest. 9 razorbacks dead, 6 fled, 0 humans killed. Illyra stood in the middle of her camp, surrounded by bodies and blood and burning torches, and she raised her spear to the sky and screamed in triumph. And somewhere in the forest the monarch heard that scream and remembered the strange creature that had faced it down with fire. That night, Illyra ate well. She cooked razorback meat over her fire, and she reinforced her walls with razorback bones, and she added 9 new skulls to her perimeter markers. The message was clear. Now, this was not prey. This was something else entirely, and every creature on Vex's 9 was beginning to understand that approaching the sulfur springs meant death. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, a consortium trading vessel named the Silver Current picked up a weak signal from the direction of Vex's 9, and the crew gathered on the bridge to discuss what they had detected. The signal was definitely a standard emergency beacon from a human vessel, but it was coming from a Category 7 death world. The captain was a Korvathi named Vesik, who had been flying trade routes through this sector for 40 years and had heard the stories about Vex's 9. And the colonists who had died there, no one survives on Vex's 9. He told his crew the signal must be automated. Some crashed ships sending out a distress call long after its occupants perished. But consortium law required them to investigate all distress signals, and so Desik ordered a shuttle prepared for descent. He expected to find wreckage. He expected to find bones if he found anything at all. He did not expect what he actually found. The shuttle broke through the cloud layer over the forested region where the signal originated, and Desik looked out the viewport and saw the fires. Dozens of them, arranged in patterns that were too regular to be natural geometric shapes of flame that marked the boundaries of something that could only be artificial. He flew lower, and the structures became visible walls made of sharpened stakes reinforced with bones, trenches filled with steaming water, a network of paths and platforms and defensive positions that spread across nearly an acre of cleared land, and standing at the center of it all, watching the shuttle descend, was a figure covered in mud and dried blood, wearing armor made from the bones and hides of creatures that Desik recognized as apex predators from the planetary survey files, a human alive waving at them to land. Desik would later describe this moment in interviews that would be translated into 100 languages and broadcast across the galaxy. "We thought we were coming to collect a corpse," he said. "Instead, we found a conqueror." The shuttle landed in a clear area that looked like it had been specifically prepared for exactly this purpose, and Desik led his crew down the ramp with weapons drawn, because everything they knew about Vex's 9 told them that danger could come from any direction at any moment. The human walked toward them without any sign of fear. She moved like she owned this place. She moved like the predators in the surrounding forest were her subjects rather than her. "Threats took you long enough," she said, and her voice was rough from weeks of disuse, but there was humor in it. "I was starting to think I would have to build a whole city before anyone showed up." Desik stared at her, and then at the camp around her, and then back at her, and he could not find words because nothing in his 40 years of experience had prepared him for this. The rescue team spent 3 hours documenting what Illyra had built, and during those 3 hours, not a single predator approached the perimeter. The razorbacks watched from the tree line, but they kept their distance. The flying hunters circled high above, but they did not dive. Even the ground did not shake with the footsteps of anything large. The territory belonged to the human, and every creature on this part of the planet knew it. Desik asked her how she had done it, how a single human with almost no technology had survived and thrived on a world that had killed thousands of better-equipped colonists. Illyra looked at her camp and at the skulls on the stakes and at the fires that had kept her alive through the long nights, and she thought about the question for a long time before answering. Everything on this planet wanted to kill me, she said, but none of them wanted it badly enough. Humans do not just survive, we dig in. We adapt, we make the place ours, and eventually, even the monsters learn to stay away from our campfire. The footage from the rescue went viral across the galactic network within hours of the silver current reaching the nearest communication relay. Species that had dismissed humans as fragile, short-lived creatures watched in amazement as analysts broke down what Alira had accomplished. She had used the predator's own instincts against them. She had established psychological dominance through displays of aggression and fire. She had created defensive structures using only the materials available in her environment. She had survived and conquered in a place where survival was supposed to be impossible. The Galactic Council's Xenanthropology Division requested her for interviews. Military strategists from a dozen species studied her fortification techniques. Survival experts across 100 worlds began incorporating her methods into their training programs. Alira became famous in a way that no human had ever been famous before. Not because she had defeated an army or discovered a new technology or led a great movement, but because she had refused to die. She had looked at a world designed to kill her, and she had said no, and the world had eventually accepted her answer. 2 years later, the Galactic Council reclassified Vex's 9, not as habitable because it was still deadly to anyone who was not prepared, but as conditionally accessible under the new VOS protocols, which established guidelines for how properly equipped and trained individuals could establish footholds on Category 7 worlds using the techniques that Alira had pioneered. Her name would be attached to those protocols forever, a single human woman who had turned a death sentence into a survival manual. The Kithari raiders who had attacked the Meridian's Grace and caused Alira's crash were eventually captured by Consortium security forces, and when they learned that their victim had survived, Vex's 9, several of them requested immediate execution. They preferred death to the possibility that Alira Voss might be involved in their interrogation. She was not involved because she had better things to do. Alira returned to space and eventually earned her own command, and she flew trade routes and exploration missions, and she wore a single razorback fang on a chain around her neck as a reminder of where she had been and what she had overcome. Interviewers often asked her if she would ever go back to Vex's 9. She always smiled when they asked this question. I left some unfinished walls there, she would say. Might have to expand someday. She never did go back. A dumb camp she built remained standing for years after her rescue, and passing ships would sometimes detect the old fire pits and defensive structures on their sensors, and knew. Analysts would add notes to the planetary files, evidence of human habitation. Present approach with caution, and somewhere in the forests of Vex's 9, the descendants of the Razorbacks still avoided the territory near the sulfur springs. They did not remember why, but their instincts told them that something dangerous had lived there once, something that even the monarch had feared, something that had come from the stars and refused to die. And deep in their simple predator brains, they understood that if that something ever returned, they should stay far, far away, because humans do not just survive. Humans conquer, and once they claim a place as theirs, they never truly leave it. The fire of Alira Voss still burned in that forest. Even if the flames had long since gone out, her spirit remained, watching, waiting, daring anything to try again.